and our meeting is being recorded. I'm the secretary of the University of Otago Alumni in America organization. We're all Otago graduates from across a broad spectrum of disciplines and age ranges, I would say. So our connections with Otago extend a long way back. We're particularly delighted to bring you this opportunity in such a timely way to talk with Hamish Bond, who's a triple gold medalist from his Olympic endeavours over the years, and Kereyn Smith, who's the current CEO of the New Zealand Olympic Committee, member of the IOC. And I first thought we'd ask Hamish and then Kereyn to introduce themselves to you, and then we'll talk about their experiences at the Olympics and ask them to share their points of view on high performance sport and opportunities for New Zealand in this area. And then we'd love to get questions from you, the audience. And you're most welcome to do that either by putting a note in the chat, which is your question, or letting me know in the chat that you'd like to ask a question. And our team, thank you, from the Department of Alumni Relations in Dunedin, will take care of opening up your speaker when that occurs. So thank you all for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you here this evening, and an extremely warm welcome and heartiest congratulations to Hamish and also to Kereyn for the performance of the team. Hamish, clearly for your performance this time round, but I think it's a lifetime of achievements too. So our warmest congratulations to you.
Thank you. Should I take the floor?
Take the floor too, please.
All right. Yeah, so obviously my name's Hamish Bond. My connection to Otago is primarily I was born there back in 1986. So I spent my first few years in Dunedin and then moved to mid-Canterbury before going back to Dunedin to board at Otago Boys High School, where I spent all my high school years. And following my time there, I did 2 second semesters at Otago University whilst staying at Knox College. I did second semesters because during the first semester I was involved with age grade rowing teams based at Lake Karapiro in Cambridge. So that's, I guess, my link to the university, and obviously have used and abused their rowing facilities on the Otago Harbour over the years, pretending to be a close alumni, but Glenn Sinclair, who's in charge there, he's always had the door open for me when I need it. And yeah, so I have close ties with Dunedin. My parents live there, my older brother lives there, and yeah, don't get down there too often, but largely due to I guess time constraints and opportunities, but hopefully going forward there'll be a few more. Myself at the moment, obviously just returned from the Tokyo Olympics, trying to work out what I'm doing with my life. So currently, I guess somewhat quasi unemployed. I do have a part-time position with Forsyth Bar, who have been obviously Dunedin originated, not necessarily based, I suppose based company, and have always been very supportive of me, which has been fantastic. And yeah, just I suppose I have three children, all under 4, so fairly busy on the home front. And my wife is currently on maternity leave. We had our most recent son a few weeks ago, 5 weeks ago, while I was in quarantine coming back from the Olympics. So you know, it's been all go for sure. So I've sort of been waiting to take our breath, but this recent lockdown kind of interrupted that. But we're just sort of getting back into a flow of what life is going to look like post Olympics, because it's certainly been fluid for quite some time. But yeah, happy to share, I guess, my experiences, and quite topical talking to, as I just mentioned, to Jacinta, quite topical talking to American-based alumni, as my wife and I are most probably, or not most probably, definitely going to be USA-based from the middle of next year, she's taken up a surgical fellowship at Duke University, so that's for a minimum of 12 months and perhaps looking for a further 12 months in North America, be it USA or Canada. So yeah, quite interesting to touch base, I suppose, with familiar or people with a similar background. And yeah, that's about me.
Thank you, Hamish. And we do appreciate that you jumped from, you know, the isolation of 2 weeks on your own in a hotel room home to a family of very excited and very young newcomers. So thank you for giving us your time this evening, of course, or today for you. Kereyn, my friend, over to you.
Oh, kia ora tātou, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to connect with lots of names I know on the screen here, and also really cool to be here with Hamish, because although he's obviously got incredible prowess in the water, and mine not at all on the athletic endeavour field, our paths have crossed a lot over the years, and you know, in awe of his achievements in Olympic and Commonwealth sports, in fact, which we'll talk about. Yeah, I've really strong ties to Otago and to Dunedin. I grew up in Clinton, which, for those of you who are not too sure, is a mega metropolis place halfway between Dunedin and Invercargill. I was the youngest of a family of 6, none of whom went to university. So not only was I actually a mistake, I think I was the one who was kind of destined for that opportunity and grabbed it with both hands. So my interest has always been in sport, more particularly, I think, in kind of imparting in the education side and in leadership and development. So initially I went to Otago University to train at phys ed school, and loved that opportunity. And I have to say, I would say that the University of Otago actually had a profound impact on my life, because I think what you do is you kind of grow up there, because you meet new people and lifelong friends, and it kind of sets you on a pathway. So I was really, really grateful to the university for that opportunity. Unbeknown to me, a few years later, after pursuing, I did phys ed teaching for a few years, and then travelled overseas and came back and started working in sports leadership and sports management, which, although it was in the late 80s, was actually just a really new thing. It would, you know, the New Zealand sport hasn't been professionalised for very long at all, and by that I don't necessarily mean playing players and athletes. I mean actual administrators. And so that was a very new pathway in New Zealand, unlike in the US, where it's, you know, there's layers of involvement by professional people. So I moved into sports management, and I guess you call it leadership, and worked in the areas of for government and sport, for the Minister of Sport, and an organisation which was called the Hillary Commission, which is now Sport New Zealand. So sort of those areas, and also where Hamish and I, our paths crossed a few years ago, was in the high performance sort of development pathway, what we call the Academy of Sport. At that time also, it was based in Dunedin, the South Island Academy of Sport, and I was CEO there. And we hooked up and worked alongside the University of Otago. And at that stage, I was fortunate to be appointed to the council, University of Otago Council, for 10 years actually, and really loved that 10 years back living in Dunedin and working across the South Island in New Zealand. And that was very much about supporting athletes, supporting coaches, you know, the early days of us sort of, again, I use the word loosely, professionalising our performance system in New Zealand. So that was another time I connected with the University of Otago, and I guess, you know, was involved with the building as a trustee for the Forsyth Bar Stadium, and worked alongside Sir Ian Edgar and the 4 Bar people. So all these networks are forever intertwined. So yeah, and now obviously in this job, New Zealand Olympic Committee, probably don't have so much direct involvement with Otago or the university. However, always very soft place in my heart, and also all the kind of people just keep reconnecting. So my job presently is a retiring, well, not actually, I've been told, I think it's retreading CEO in the New Zealand Olympic Committee role, a job I've been in for just under 11 years. So it's well timed to move into a different phase, and also great for the organisation because there's some really exciting sort of, I guess, changes coming around Olympic pathways. So it's a good time for me to look at the next steps. So thanks, Jacinta. That's a little bit about me in Otago.
Thank you, Kereyn. And actually, now you mention it, I still have a letter opener from your time as the private secretary to the Minister of Sport. So I believe it's a Bellamy's letter opener. So some things never disappear.
Awesome.
Thank you. So let's turn to talk about Tokyo and Tokyo 2020, as it was in 2021, and thinking about the New Zealand team. Clearly a distinct occasion, and I would say here in the US we had 24/7 television coverage, and I'm delighted to say I think we saw every New Zealand sports event, so we were very fortunate. But it felt different as a viewer. It felt like the team dynamic itself was incredibly strong. And I wonder, perhaps starting with you, Hamish, how would you describe the culture and just the relationship between people on the New Zealand team? What made it good or different for you?
Yeah, I mean, it was different. The Olympics themselves were different for me on multiple levels. Primarily going in a boat. It almost flipped it back to my first experience at the Olympics at Beijing, where I was in a men's four. And then the subsequent, obviously, London and Rio with Eric. We went in as heavy favourites. Expectations were to win or fail. And really quite different. All we could do was meet expectation. And that's, I guess, the tough part about being at the top of your game, is that it's very hard to exceed expectation. Really, all you can do is hit your target, and that's it. So you sort of, along with that, you just, my principal emotion post London and Rio was just a sense of relief that we met our own and others' expectations. Whereas going into Tokyo with the men's 8, a project that I wouldn't say I initiate, but definitely resuscitated when I came back to the sport after my stint in cycling post Rio. The expectations were quite different, both from ourselves and certainly externally. I don't think there were many expectations, or not certainly high expectations. So that was the first point of difference. Secondly, obviously, COVID, obviously overhanging every logistical decision. And certainly there was a lot of work done. I suppose Kereyn can talk about that more in terms of our logistics on the ground and how that operated. But in terms of the team dynamics and culture, it was noticeable. I think there's been a noticeable shift from since, I don't know, Kereyn could perhaps talk about it as well, whether it's a Rob Waddell thing or just a general evolution, but a certain shift in the mindset and operation, I suppose, of the Olympic team after London. I think London was quite performance-based, but certainly Rio and Tokyo felt quite a tight-knit team, very professional, very respectful, just far more objective, I suppose. Like people knew what they were doing, knew what they were about. And with obviously the COVID disruptions and being far more, it was funny because you were sort of obviously meant to be social distancing and all that. And there was that within our own wee bubble, we were largely sticking to our sporting groups and trying not to mix and mingle as much as possible within the wider New Zealand team. But in saying that, there was a definite team camaraderie, I think, that there wasn't exactly adversity to overcome, like everything worked pretty seamless, but there was just that overarching sense of a higher degree of camaraderie amongst the team, I think, this year. And certainly the people involved. I think if you look at the senior athletes, I wouldn't put myself necessarily there in terms of a Uber team guy. Maybe I am within my own network in rowing and in the rowing team, but I don't put myself forward necessarily in the wider New Zealand Olympic team. But there certainly were those people who do that job well. My stand-in flag bearer, David Nika, I think did a great job on that front. Obviously led from the front from the athlete support people, and Kereyn could probably talk about that more. I think they do a great job in making all the athletes feel comfortable. I mean, it's not a big deal for me, but if I wind back the clock to Beijing, you know, it's my 4th Olympics, so I'm relatively versed in what's going on. But on the flip side of that, there's a lot of people who have far less experience, and I think the way that they operate, to me, it almost seems it's bordering on overbearing and too much to me, because I am comfortable and familiar, but I could certainly appreciate to the more inexperienced members that would be really welcome, just to have those friendly, familiar faces. So yeah, I think the senior athletes did a great job in across all the sports and bringing everyone together. And I suppose that made up somewhat for not being able to go out and support our fellow members, because that's the principal difference with the Olympics compared to our general competition, is that you get the opportunity to mix and mingle and support other codes, whereas obviously at a World Rowing Champs it's just the people that we know on a daily basis, whereas at the Olympic Games, you know, there's generally that opportunity to get out to other sports and support, and once your competition's finished typically, so that was sort of taken away. So that, I guess, that got put into focus just in our own team building,
Right.
you know, like that wider, instead of going out to venues, you know, like that sort of was focused either on social media and through telecommunications, I guess, and also just in the building. It was just that vibe. So
Yep.
It was quite cool. Yeah, everyone was a pretty kumbaya attitude, which like I'm yeah, I like a little bit of kumbaya, but sometimes it's too
You're a
much.
Southern man, Hamish. We
Yeah,
understand.
that's pretty
We
much it.
appreciate
Yeah. It's I
Kereyn,
like the
what about
kumbaya as long as it doesn't get in my way.
Yeah, there you go. And Kereyn, thinking about it from sort of the logistics and all the things that we often don't get to see as observers of the games, what stood out for you, both in terms of how things worked very well and what was different or challenging this time?
I almost feel sick thinking about it, to be honest, because it's such a big question. It's hard to just know where to start. But what I would say is that, just to jump onto the couple of points that Hamish was making, it was really interesting as things played out, because this Olympic team was, 2020 was going to be it's the 100 years of a New Zealand Olympic team competing, you know, at the Olympic Games. So Tokyo 2020 was a milestone year, was to be a milestone year, for many, many reasons. And I recall our sort of team support people led by Rob Waddell, the chef de mission, came back from the last site visit in March 2020. And just aside from there was some smatterings of COVID, which we thought, what is this thing? Just were feeling, yep, you know, we've got this thing. You know, the venues are ready. They were stunning. The village was ready. It was amazing. We had a New Zealand house set up, which is for our friends and family and supporters, and merchandise to sell, and just an amazing setup there. It was just utopia in terms of Olympic planning. And then day by day, you know, it started to unravel very quickly, because in fact the actual games were postponed at the end of March. So if we think about that pathway from utopia to, you know, is this thing ever going to happen? It was a very quick dismantling exercise. And funnily enough, most of those plans, aside from the hardware that existed in Tokyo itself, and those venues were stunning. You know, every venue you saw, with people, it would have been something else.
Yeah.
You know, everything about it was so prepared, but then everything started to come crumbling down. Every plan, every piece of operation So we basically had to go right back to square one. So once we kind of had got through the stage of, okay, these things aren't happening, and trying to get, good sustained communications with athletes and just keeping everyone focused, it was then, honestly, God, like climbing a mountain that felt like it was getting higher every day. And I don't mean to be dramatic, but it was kind of getting to that point when we realized that in order to do all of these countermeasures and all the planning and get athletes vaccinated and tested from around the world to get into Tokyo to compete and be the best they could be and do all of their preparation justice. Meanwhile, all their qualifications were changing, and we kind of had to rebuild and do our normal Olympics, which, to give you an idea, logistically, it's a massive undertaking. It's about 8,500 bed nights just for the team. So it's like kind of running a hotel. It's around about 21,000, I think, pieces of equipment and clothing that needs to be kitted out on people. We have a long list of people, potentially 1,000 people who could go to the Olympic Games, and that narrows down to around about 220. So 1 in 5 that start that journey, about 1 in 5 get there. About 20 tonne of gear, and then there's all the other bits and bobs. So in terms of the logistical kind of side of it, it's big. But then it became obvious to us that we also had to have around about 1,500 vaccines for people across 25 different countries of the world. We then needed to have time-sensitive pre-testing for athletes. Everyone had to have 3 of them before they landed across 25 countries of the world. And then we kind of also had to think about MIQ and getting into MIQ and planning MIQ, getting charter planes to get home, and all these things on top of just what was a normal big gig. And as well as that, then thinking about all of the friends and family who had booked and paid to go to the Olympics, unbundling all of that, which still was unbundling. So it really just felt like the mountain was getting higher and higher. And so what I think it did, and I think this is what COVID does for us all, is it focuses us really back on what matters. And when you really come back to the core of what matters, it's all about the athletes, and it's all about keeping things, do things, simple things really well, and work with people, communicate with people. Because while many of the athletes are in sports like rowing, many of them are not. So some of these athletes are going there, with a volunteer coach. People are taking time off. They don't have any financial support. Mum and dad have mortgaged their house to get them there. So, we have a very diverse athlete community, and there were 21 different sports represented at Tokyo. So I think, so in the end, it was a very different games for all of those reasons. And I think there were some unexpected positive consequences. And one of them, I think, Hamish, you touched on there, which is probably because athletes and people couldn't turn out to their family and out to their friends, and they turned towards each other. And it felt to me like there was a big build of character and of culture, and New Zealand's personality shone on the world stage across those different sports. And we actually saw successes in sports that we haven't, in gymnastics and trampolining. We've never had a medal in trampolining before, but something like tennis and men's doubles. I mean, the last medal in tennis was Anthony Wilding, and we all know that was a long time ago. So there was some real breakthroughs, and if you said what am I most proud of, I'm most proud of how our team represented our country on the world stage, and how through some of the work that we did around our 100-year team celebrations, we had, through advice from Derek Liddell, who is from Ngāti Porou and a well-renowned cultural and Māori artist, he worked on developing a haka for the New Zealand team, because previously we'd used other hakas, or loaned or with approval, a haka, waiata, and a lot more cultural depth, and I guess thinking about our values and where did we come, what was this 100-year story about, and what does the silver fern stand for, and who are we, and what do we want to look like on the world stage. And I think it was just those elements came together better than we expected, because we didn't think we were going to be able to do a haka, because we didn't think we could kind of do that external kind of thing, but we found a way, didn't we, Hamish? Outside there was a lovely area that
Yeah, I don't know. I think people just looked the other way, didn't they?
And so I think, to answer your question, Jacinta, I think in summary, it was a very different games. It was sad there wasn't, you know, amazing venues full of people, and it was sad for the Tokyo and Japanese people that wasn't a dream to be realised. But it produced, to me, unprecedented benefits in terms of, I think New Zealanders had forgotten just how exciting and engaging the Olympics can be, and just really showed what we stand for. I mean, a country the size of New Zealand ending up 11th on the 13th on the medal table, you know, is an incredible achievement out of 206 countries. So that's a big thing. And the other thing that I really recall is just before the games started, and the Secretary General of the WHO was speaking, and I was listening at an Olympic forum, and he was talking about the importance of the Olympic Games for the future of global interaction, and talking about the fact that there is never no risk. There's only more risk or less risk. And the future of global interaction is about how we learn to live with COVID, and how we learn to come together but stand apart, to behave differently and wear masks and respect distance and all of those things. And in fact, what the Olympics could do, and he hoped it would do, was show the world that this was possible. And if you think about it, there were, of all the delegates and people that went into Japan, 0.02% got COVID. 0.2% of people from 206 countries. And I think I'm right that most of that COVID transmission occurred on planes,
right,
flying. And so what this was actually the global mountaintop for the world. It was an opportunity to show the world that people can come together, and if they adhere and are disciplined and strong, that there is a way forward. And so I think from a bigger global picture, that was pretty cool.
That's a great point. And if I think about the comment you just made, Kereyn, and the Olympics perhaps becoming the model for the way the world will have to operate, you know, for the foreseeable future, I wonder what it does for the future of top level sport in Aotearoa, and how do athletes get those opportunities to get experience and competition and get to be games ready in the intervening years when travel and access is probably very different to what it was. And Hamish, I'm thinking, you know, with your vision and with your experience in both rowing and cycling, you know, what do you see as the pathway for high performance sport in New Zealand and staying on the world stage?
Yeah, I sort of was looking towards Tokyo and haven't put much thought beyond that. I think I would argue that there's probably I don't know, maybe it's changing, maybe I just am out of touch, but I would say that a number of sports are still thinking that it may go back to how it was. I would suggest, but I'm not in touch with management. Kereyn might know more. I don't know. I suspect it depends on the sport and the nature of their funding. You know, like if you're a professional sport, I'm just going to spitball, say the rugby union, who, you know, relies on ticket sales and TV rights and all that sort of jazz. If you're looking at your funding dribbling out, you know, you are dynamic and you are thinking what's happening next year, what's happening. Whereas I think perhaps some of the Olympic sports maybe, you know, who more typically rely on government funding are perhaps a little more static in their thinking because they have more surety around their funding. If I look at it from an athlete's point of view, I think it's been, like Kereyn said, it's actually been largely proven that I suppose there's always different variants and Delta establishing itself more and more, but I think except from New Zealand and Australia, sport looks to be carrying on mostly around the world. I know the sports bulletin here at night, there's very little local content, obviously, and it's largely filled up with international sporting, which it's always quite ironic how gloating we were probably back. When was it? When we were having rugby tests at Eden Park and no one else was empty stadiums, and now it's the flip. And we're the ones that are all locked down, and yeah, the world seems to be carrying on. So obviously everyone's well versed on the reasons for that, and I think athletes by nature are pretty dynamic in thinking. I mean, it's not, so I don't see it being a problem. I mean, ultimately all you can do is evolve and survive, or not and die, or not die, but you know, in terms of your career and aspirations. I think if you all you can do is operate with the landscape you have in front of you, and I think athletes have always done that and will continue to do that. And yeah, there's no alternative. So it's I think that's basically, and that was the way that Tokyo was approached. You know, it was, okay, what's the current situation? What do we need to do to participate? What's plan A look like? What's plan B? What knowledge, you know, what do we have in front of us? What information do we have? And yeah, essentially that's, I guess, the mantra in uncertain environment is control the controllables. And if you do that, then fate will take care of the rest, and you can't be too perturbed on the result because, you know, you did what you could. I think athletes are pretty good at managing that situation, because you sort of live an uncertain existence anyway, you know, selection, injury, motivation, whatever it may be, you know, tomorrow could be your last day. So I think given that, you learn to be pretty dynamic and evolve with the times.
It's a great, the resiliency of athletes. Kereyn, what about, from your lens, the aspiring Olympians? You know, what impact do you think Tokyo 2020 and the New Zealand team results have had on their aspirations?
Yeah, I think it can only be positive, and I do just on that point that Hamish was answering there. I think the next 12 months are pretty complicated for some pathways for emerging athletes to have certainty. So what we're immediately thinking about at the moment is the Winter Olympics are in Beijing in February 2022. Now, at the moment, the situation is that no one can get into China unless you do 3 weeks quarantine, and at the moment, then you don't even know if you can even move freely around the setup. We're not allowed to go to the venue. So, you know, think about our athletes right now who are going to an Olympic Games, you know, and we have some very talented young winter athletes who will be named in a New Zealand team this weekend. And that's at the moment, and they're thinking about MIQ and about competitions. And so it's a bit different. And I think what it's meant is people's mindset has to be adaptable, like Hamish said. So I think where people are quite challenged, some athletes are quite challenged by the uncertainty. So that's been a trick for them. And we've also, the Commonwealth Games are in Birmingham in about 10 months' time. And many of our funded sports, and some that have been to Tokyo, they've qualified, they've got a pathway there. But for many sports who are less funded and or athletes emerging, it's very hard to see a competition pathway at the moment, because if they leave, basically they can't get back. And, you know, so it's tough. So I think it's not an easy thing, but I think if we cast out to Paris 2024 for the next Olympics and beyond, there's an amazing runway of Olympic cities and Olympic opportunities. So it goes Paris, Los Angeles 2028, and then amazingly and excitingly Brisbane 2032. So there's a good long runway. The short runway is murky. But what I would say, I think it's going to be really interesting in the fullness of time when we finish debrief in Tokyo, is on the way through and in the kind of postponed year, I'd be interested in Hamish's views on this. New Zealand had to look into itself to create it's our own world-class training environment.
Mm-hmm.
And we had less competition. Hamish and his crew did an amazing job. They went to the last chance regatta to qualify their space for Tokyo and then slammed it once they got it. But, you know, that was you were one of the few squads, weren't you, Hamish, that actually left the country and competed on the world stage. So most of our athletes went into Tokyo without having a long preparation. They mainly, except for those living and playing overseas in football, equestrian, golf, tennis, mainly they'd been in New Zealand training, trying to conduct their business in a winter environment and then going into Tokyo. So preparing for heat and all of that. But the amazing thing about all this is that we had way less demands on our medical team in a global pandemic than we did in the Rio Olympics and we did in London. So the fact that people were masked, they came in healthy, they trained and prepared, they hadn't been traveling around the world and maybe run down or people sick or whatever, led to, you know, healthier, better, you know, and maybe this might change some of our plans and preparations and approaches for campaigns in the future. I mean, you know, in the sport like rowing, Hamish, you would have usually been spending maybe 3 months a year in Europe, away from home, whatever. I mean, you know, those things may well now change because we know we can do things differently, and coaches, and, you know, it's very disruptive for everybody's life, the way we've had to be operating in New Zealand. So I think that while there's uncertainty, there's also incredible learnings, and while there is disruption, we needed to innovate, and sports innovated and got results, and we need to learn from all of those things, I think. So I don't know if that even answers the question, but
it's a great answer. And actually, you know, for people who are in the business of business rather than the business of sport, I think the things that you've both shared are lessons for all of us, not just for sport. So I think it's a great observation. I'm going to put a final question to each of you now, and then I'd love to throw it open to people on the call. I see we have a question already in the chat, and if anyone has a question, feel free to put it in the chat or let us know that you'd like to ask the question. You're welcome to unmute and also turn your camera on if you like. But let me first kind of lead into that by Hamish talking, I guess, as one of New Zealand's revered athletes, and I think, you know, you too earn a goat somewhere in your on your CV, I'm sure. But you've performed at the highest level, obviously in the Olympics. You've changed codes and performed at the highest level in the Commonwealth Games, or you've shared codes. So how do you stay grounded and focused? And obviously now with a young family and potential to be traveling and living elsewhere next year, what makes you get out of bed in the morning and keep doing the training and the hard work that you obviously have to do to reach the peak performance?
I think my motivation has again evolved over time. I used to row because it was something that I was good at, and yeah, I guess it just gave me an avenue to, I don't know why. I mean, it's always a snowball, you know, like you start at one point and you never know where you're going to end up. But certainly this last Olympic cycle, motivations have been different. Perspective has been different. Obviously with a family, the hours and dedication that I could put to training, I probably had to be a bit smarter in terms of the way that I worked. And I think in terms of staying grounded and focused, I think my wife has been quite influential in that. Yeah, I wouldn't say she cuts me down, but, you know, I think New Zealand does that. You know, like if you get too big for your boots, you'll know about it pretty quick in New Zealand. But certainly coming back, it has been pleasant being out amongst, once we've been able to get out and amongst the recognition that I've seen just out at the supermarket around my neighbourhood here has been marked even compared to Olympics past. And I think for me, on a personal level, that was probably, I think, part of being successful in the 8. I always knew that that would be different to the 8 is the blue ribbon event in rowing, and it sits differently with the country. It's more of a country team medal as opposed to an individual medal. And I had the feeling, based off, we last won that in 1972 as a country, and it is still talked about frequently, not only in rowing circles, but those of the age to remember. If you say you're a rower, like, oh, I remember, 72, da, da, da. So, I just had a sense that it would sit differently. And it has been a shame that with the lockdown back here, maybe some of the younger guys haven't had that opportunity to experience that post-Olympic glow to its maximum. But with any luck, there'll be that opportunity going forward. So, rowing's right. Like I feel as though I have pretty good perspective on where sport sits on a global landscape. Yep. And if you have that, and certainly having children adds to that. I sort of had a bit of a sense of it in the past, I guess, with Eric, but more from the shoe being on the other foot, and that his focus was not as high towards the rowing as I would have liked it, because he obviously had his son. But yeah, it has evolved over time.
And I have to put in a little plug here. I'm thrilled to say that our Alumni Association, so AUOA, we have a wonderful member of our founding advisory board, Sir Murray Brennan, who in fact we have a rowing scholarship at Otago, which is really honouring Sir Murray, and certainly very well supported by Sir Murray too financially. So I think rowing is here to stay, Hamish, without a doubt. And I see your friend from Dunedin on there too, Glenn.
We have to evolve as well as a sport. There's obviously a push. Well, I don't know if it's widely known, but we're fairly high in terms of participant numbers at the Olympics. And I know there's a continual push to diversify the sports, bring in new sports. Obviously, this year we saw skateboarding and rock climbing, and I know it changes again at the next Olympics. And I think rowing has to really, again, think on their feet and almost in some ways preempt that, jump to a new model before they're pushed. So I think that's something that needs to be thought about. I'm sure it is thought about, but our sport's very Eurocentric, but I'm sure they're aware of the pressure from the Olympic Committee to perhaps reduce our participant numbers, and I have some ideas around how that could be facilitated, but no one's asked me for them yet.
Well, thank you. And we have the questions pouring on, which is awesome. I'm going to turn to them in a minute, but I have one final question for Kereyn, because you, as you shared with this group, you are retreading, not retiring. And I'm looking forward personally to what that might bring in the future. But what, in the time you've been in NZOC and you've been involved in sport, what are the greatest challenges and what were your greatest achievements? And I especially want to know what you're going to do with all those air points when you can actually get to fly again.
Well, thanks, Jacinda. Well, I mean, it's gosh, it's gone quite quickly, and it's sort of put into perspective, Hamish, when you talk about competing in Beijing. So didn't quite go back that far, but I started in 2011, and my sort of personal vision was that I thought that our Olympic team and our Commonwealth teams could stand for a lot more than just sport. So I guess one of my greatest challenges has always been about trying to create the value proposition. And I think I'm talking to business people here, but I was always really determined, because we've got a very proud Olympic history in New Zealand, and I know Hamish, has talked about Sir Murray Halberg and others, but when we reflect over the years at particular Olympics, we typically have had one or two memories, but now where we're sitting in our Olympic profile, there's many memories. There's so many, there's different stories. I mean, you take it out in like the 8 story that Hamish was part of, it's magical. It's so
Yep.
Kiwi. It's amazing. And then you've got the Lydia Coes, and you've got the Dame Val Adams, and then you've got the women's sevens and what that stood for, and the men's. There's so many stories. And I think what I have always been motivated, and I think it's been a challenge, but I think we're making progress, is how does our New Zealand Olympic team and all it stands for lift brand New Zealand? How do we create a platform where our athletes can have a voice, and they've got character, and they bring culture, and they're different to other parts of the world, and showcase us on the world stage as a country that's innovative, that's successful, but humble? And how do we really capture that opportunity to build connections for New Zealand, to create influence, and also reflecting back into our country to inspire young people and to engage young people? And Hamish is so right, because many young people may not connect with rowing, but they will with something in the Olympic Commonwealth program. It might now be skateboarding, it might be rock climbing, it might be sevens, it might be netball or bowls or cricket. But that's always been a kind of a challenge, and I think we're starting to get that bigger platform. So that's one thing. The other thing that I think has been a challenge is there's a really interesting dilemma and discussion in global sport now around the well-being piece. And I think I've been lucky enough to be involved in an era where New Zealand sport has grown in success as a result of more investment, more structure, more strategy. And probably in that era, we've really made advances in technology and sports science and the like, and we've probably left some of the human elements behind. And we see this in world sport. So, we've had a big discussion here around athlete wellbeing and welfare, and as we should, and it's been made worse through COVID and all of that. And that's a global conversation. I mean, you're seeing it in the States with Simone Biles, and, it's kind of a global conversation. So I think one of our biggest challenges is how, as a small country at the bottom of the world with big ambition, do we create and sustain a successful sporting not a system? Well, how do we keep pace? And I guess one of my greatest fears was, if we went to Tokyo, we might have been 30th on the medal table, and that wouldn't have been that cool, because people say, well, winning isn't everything, but I tell you what, it's pretty important.
It's quite,
so
quite a bit.
I think our challenge, and one of my challenges, and one of the things is, like the cost for us of doing business has just got so high, and our standards are high. So that's a tricky one. On the other side, just to say the best things for me, it's privilege. I mean, I'm a weenie wheel and a weenie cog rather, and a great big wheel. And it's a privileged opportunity to be, at a place where people win gold medals, or, where new history is created. I mean, being there at that magical half hour at the rowing, with the Hamish, with the eights, with the women's eights, and Emma Twigg, winning a medal. I mean, that is, it's very, very special. And the rawness of the disappointments is also really heartening. So, I mean, it's just a privilege to be part of that. And it's great that I've been there for all your medals, Hamish. So I might be your little, I might be your superpower.
You're the talisman.
The other thing I'd just like to say very briefly, the fact that I'm really proud of how, as an organisation, we have worked really hard to achieve international standing around our inclusivity and our diversity, and how the New Zealand Olympic team and our Commonwealth Games teams represent New Zealanders. They are inclusive. There's faces of all cultures there, and men and women in Paralympics now as well, doing a great job. Yeah. We had some tricky issues around dealing with the first transgender athlete, openly transgender athlete, and Laurel Hubbard at both the Commonwealth Games and Tokyo Games. And I only say it was tricky because it's first and there's such divided opinions. But, on reflection, I'm very satisfied that we did everything we could, and so did her teammates, to support her. And I'm proud that we're at the forefront of that kind of conversation, because that's where New Zealanders are. So if we're not leading, we're following, and we want to be leaders. And so, you know, those things make me particularly proud of what we've achieved.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to our questions, and Hamish, we've got two here that I'm going to put to you, from Dr. Carol MacArthur, who herself was an athlete in the 80s, if I'm correct, a middle distance runner who trained at the Kelly. So that in itself, I think, is a sign of resiliency. But her question is, what was it like training in Dunedin? And she asked that because of her own experiences with the wind at the Caledonian. But for you, what was it like? And then my second question, which is I'm going to tag on to that, is from Glenn Sinclair, who wants to know if it's true that you gave the men's pair an ultimatum to join the Eights. So both questions over to you, Hamish.
If I told you, Glenn, I'd have to kill you. So yeah, training in Dunedin. I'll be honest, the vast majority of my high-level training has been at Lake Karapiro or international. So I came through school based in Dunedin, and then probably 2 summers, I would say, I was based at in Dunedin, and winters based at Lake Karapiro. So certainly, you know, we're a bit like Wellington, I suppose. You can't beat the Otago Harbour on a good day, but they're few and far between. Yeah, so it certainly gives you the ability to row in all conditions. We actually did, as a school, quite a bit of training on the Henley River, which is a tributary to the Taieri River out by the airport, which is typically a lot flatter and more consistent conditions. But yeah, training on the harbour and in Dunedin. I'll be honest, I don't think I did like a full Dunedin winter rowing. I think by the time I was training all year round, I'd managed to make New Zealand teams that were training in the North Island. So that was typically where I spent my winter. So I think I escaped the worst of it. But I do remember, yeah, trying to get down appropriately called the slip into the harbour, like the launching ramp, and yeah, if there's ice on that as well as green slime. Icy green slime is not a good combo, so I had a fair few grazes on my ass from slipping over trying to get the boat in the water.
Athlete well-being.
Yeah. Oh, second part of the question. Oh yeah, Glenn. Yeah, like I said to the pair when I first came back, so for those who don't know, obviously I used to row the pair boat with Eric, and then athletes have been in that boat since Rio and done fairly well. I think in terms of results, they got 3rd, 4th, and 2nd in 2017, 18, and 19. Typically, the pair has been the first selected boat, so some of the strongest athletes go and best athletes go in that boat. When I first came back, I said, "Oh, look, you know, if you guys want to go on the 8, that'd be great." But the guys who were incumbents in that boat at the time were medalists internationally, so why jump from an opportunity like that to go in an unproven boat? And I said, yeah, they obviously queried me as to whether I had ambition to go back into the pair, and the reality was that I didn't have any great ambition. And I certainly said to them, look, as long as you're performing and looking like you're sort of winning medals, I certainly won't get in the way of that. But yeah, just the situation rose towards the end of last year where the incumbents were really struggling as a combination. And it gave me the opportunity to get my sticky beak in there, and I sort of proved that I was still the top rower on top sweep side, stroke side rower, which is the side of the boat that I row on. And we sort of ended up in somewhat of there was obviously potential for the 8, but we ended up in some sort of détente really, where either you join me in the 8, or I race you for your spot and you miss losing that. So, you know, you pick your poison. So, like, it wasn't overly overt, but yeah, there was a little bit of, yeah, it all worked out. So, you know,
Pressure's
everyone's
always
happy.
healthy,
Yeah,
right?
we were lucky.
And that leads me to a question we have here from a caller from Invercargill, who has a question for both Hamish and Kereyn. And he asked, in the past, success by an athlete sometimes seems to be through them qualifying for the Olympics. Has this changed, and is going for gold now more of an expectation of success, or measure of success?
Well, I think that's from Tim Ward, who's wishing his sister a happy birthday for yesterday. So I should just pass that on there, Jacinta.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Look, it's really interesting and actually quite a complicated thing sometimes, the whole pathway to get to an Olympic team. And there's sort of two pieces to it. One is through the sports pathway, and the other is then to meet the standard set by the New Zealand Olympic Committee, and there's sort of various gates you have to step through. And it's fair to say I think it's probably the 90s, I don't recall specifically the era, but there was a lot of consternation around New Zealand and conversation about the fact that we probably weren't performing at a level of expectation at Olympic Games. And that was a number of reasons, and I don't really think there was a satisfactory system or funding or pathway to support that. But notwithstanding all of that, in that era, in probably early 2000s, there was a standard set by the New Zealand Olympic Committee to have a selection standard to say that we wanted to make sure that when athletes were at the Olympic Games, winter or summer, they were going to be credible performers, and they were going to be, it's worthy of being in the Olympic team. So at that time, and subsequently it has remained so, athletes have to demonstrate, all teams, that they can finish in the top 16 of the field at the Olympics. So that's the New Zealand Olympic Committee that's the finish line for selection. What actually happens in practice as an athlete, and I'll use a rower because it's probably topical and Hamish can tell me if I'm incorrect. So you start off in at World Champs, and you typically have to qualify by performing at a world event in your sport. And if you are in some sports, you qualify by name. So it might be Hamish Bond and Eric Murray qualify a seat or they qualify their boat, and they're the named people to sit in that boat and go to the Olympics. Or sometimes it's by country. And this is a really cruel situation because people qualify a spot and it's not a personal spot. And it varies across sports. So in a sport like athletics, Tom Walsh, say, had a qualification for an event by name because he had a particular result, and they had a certain number of high people by name, and then there's other spots available. So you get by name by individual, and then it comes through, and then the sport might say, and some of our sports, i.e. cycling, rowing, sailing, etc., have very high standards. So they don't nominate athletes unless they are going to be sometimes medal capable, way higher than top 16. And so it has to be a situation where they then decide, okay, we've got a spot for the men's pair for the Olympics. Who are we going to name to sit in those two seats? Who are those two people? So they then nominate people to the New Zealand Olympic Committee. And if they clearly demonstrate top 16, they go through. If not, that's a tricky conversation. With the fullness of time, things have changed. So in that era where the top 16 was brought in, we weren't having particularly high and deep results. If we reflect on the most recent Olympics, we had medal results in 11 sports and, more medals. So clearly that issue now is different. And it is therefore timely for us to say what is acceptable now in terms of our standard. However, in somewhat, it's sort of immaterial because there's all the other gateways to get through. So I guess what I'm answering your question, Tim, is to say that sometimes it depends which sport, whether the athlete qualifies by name or not. And usually in sports like cycling and rowing and yachting, etc., they usually don't. It's usually New Zealand's quota, and then people have to demonstrate form. And then the sports also decide, because they want to make sure that their crews, their athletes also get medal results, so they get funding. So there's all sorts of things that come to play in this. And after each Olympics, we review that. I think it's particularly hard if I reflect on Tokyo, where we might have had an athlete in the sport like badminton, for example, that qualified one spot, and they haven't had a badminton athlete at the Olympics since 2008. And that athlete wasn't able to demonstrate that they were going to be in the top 16, so therefore weren't selected. So at the moment, we have quite a lot of conversation in our debrief about, in today, in 2021, what should this process, that is relatively complicated, how should it come together? And so to answer your question about, is it all about going for gold? From our point of view, no. In fact, the New Zealand Olympic Committee doesn't have medal targets. We are there to support all athletes do the best that they can in their personal performance, you know, create the right environment and support for them to perform at the best of their ability. So it certainly helps, but that's not our driver. Our driver is around credible, high performance, global stage spotlight opportunities. So now we're reviewing that and saying what should that look like for the future. So sorry if I've confused you through that answer, but it's not straightforward.
But you don't clap the bridesmaid at a wedding, right? So I guess there is a performance target one way or another.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's the expectation. I mean, we're pretty tough. I mean, New Zealanders are relatively, you know, pretty tough on standards and performances.
Well, I think I know we're at time. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you, both Hamish and Kereyn. We both appreciate your time and giving us insight into what goes on to get to the level you perform at or you support the performance of. I think it's been such an exciting time for New Zealand. Congratulations on behalf of the team that's on this call for all that you do. And also, I think, thank you for being so human, so down to earth with your own sort of points that you made to the group. I think it's really heartwarming to know that you are very normal people, you do normal things, but you are resilient and you're always looking for a better way. So we really appreciate your time. We know you're an inspiration, Hamish in particular, an inspiration to young people coming through. I believe we have one of our own recipients of the Sir Murray Brennan Rowing Scholarship on the call, so maybe one day she'll be in a boat in the Olympics too. But we'd like to thank you so much, and I think I hand over to Danella from the Department of Alumni Relations to wrap up the session. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you, Jacinta, and thank you so much to Kereyn and Hamish for giving us your time. And I'm just seeing the Otago spirit in both of you, that humble view that you have of the world, was really heartening for all of us to hear and have that honest reflection on your experiences. So thank you so much. Hamish, I know you've only done 2 semesters at Otago, but we claim you as one of ours. Hopefully that's okay. And Kereyn, you've obviously had a huge amount of input into the university, not only as a student, but also as being a council member. So we thank you all for that. I'd also like to pass on my really sincere thanks to the AUOA for organising this. Jacinta's all her hard work to put this together, and it's been a very successful webinar, and we've seen the chats come in now with people thanking you, and especially Jacinta, it was your birthday yesterday and you were working for us, so you didn't let us on. But as we've seen, the alumni ties go deep and long and are intertwined everywhere, and Hamish spoke about that intertwining of links, and his will extend once he goes to the States, and hopefully the alumni in the US will wrap around you and help you and your family there as well. And Kereyn's also mentioned how those ties have lasted throughout the years. So we encourage all of you to stay connected with each other, either through the AUOA or through us here in Dunedin. And I thank you all for your time, and in particular Kereyn and Hamish for your time. I know it's precious to you and you've got lots on your plates, and it's been a fabulous webinar. Thank you all, and stay safe everybody, and we look forward to one day seeing you all in person and not via the screen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. See ya.
Thank you.
See ya, Hamish. See you,
Bye.
Bye.